Hello there and welcome to Paint, Batter and Roll. Today we'll be painting this Space Marine Primaris Librarian. I'll be doing it in a Blood Angles scheme, and a little bit of background of this model. I got it for free. It's not been put together particularly well. There's some gaps here and there and there are some pieces missing off the model, but I figured it was in good enough condition to feature in a video, so let's get painting. I'd like to apologise in advance for any shaky camera, any out of focus shots, and sometimes the on-screen camera iconography showing up. This is one of my first painted videos that I've done, and I promise it will get better with time. Starting with the base coats then, I'm going to paint the model from inside out just to make it easier to cover up any spills as we go along. Doing all the internals of the armour and areas that need to be black. Using Citadel's contrast paint, Black Templar. Moving on then to the mid-tone of the blue armour. Yes, it is a Blood Angel, but I've checked the codex and apparently their librarians wear blue armour. I've chosen a mid-blue, it's just called blue, from Vallejo model colour, and from this solid base coat we can work down to the shadows and up to the highlights. I will also quickly mention that I've sped the video up and put cuts in where I can. I'm not the fastest painter in the world, so to keep the length of the video down, you'll see most of the first coats of each colour that I give the model. I'll normally do a follow-up coat off camera just so that I can tidy up any mistakes, then I've got the model closer to my face. Moving on to the inner cloak of the tabard that the librarian is wearing. We're doing this in a base colour of Tan Earth by Vallejo model colour. This will give us again a mid-tone to work up and down from later on. As you can see with the base coats, I'm not using anything special for a paintbrush. It's a normal size 2 natural hairbrush, just to get the base coats on nice and evenly and also nice and quickly. Moving on then, onto the red on the model. I wanted the Blood Angels that I do to have a slightly darker red than normal, so this base colour is just red by Vallejo model colour. It comes out a little bit darker to my eye than the Fiston red, but I quite like that, a little bit less saturated. And we'll go over all the parts of this librarian that need to be red, and basically the bits that identify him as a Blood Angel. Change to a larger size brush for the cloak. As it's quite a large flat area, this just speeds things up and helps get an even coat. Onto the black base coats now. I wasn't sure at this point how dark I wanted the black on this armour to be. I suppose it's a bit of a choice that I wanted to make later on, so I've gone for a mid-grey. This is a dark blue grey from Vallejo model colour. I like it because it goes on really smooth and it provides a nice even coverage, and I can go darker or lighter with it later on depending on how I feel the rest of the model looks. I've opted for black for the skull on the shoulder pad as well to help it stand out and also tie in with the shoulder pad rims. We'll see how it looks. Here I've changed over to some Vallejo game colour black. This is just to do the undercoat for some of the metallic areas and to do the belt that he's wearing. Moving on to the base coats for some of the details. This is just a royal purple I'm going to do on the cover of his book, just to help it stand out a bit. I'll also do the tops of the purity seals on his cloak. Obviously they're normally red, but to help them stand out a little bit, but not too much, I've decided to go for purple to complement the red. You'll also notice that between cuts I've filled in the paper on the purity seals and the shoulder scroll and knee scroll with the same tan earth that I base coat the inner cloak in. Wanted a nice contrasting colour for the power sword. I went with yellow. I did start with Vallejo's deep yellow from the model colour range, but as you can see it wasn't going on particularly well and I didn't fancy doing 100 coats of yellow to get a nice even coverage, so between shots I changed it to Games Workshop's Avalanche Sunset, which is covered in 2 coats very nicely. So this is the final look of the completely base coated Primaris Marine. I'm pretty pleased with how the base coats have worked out. So from this section on I'll be focusing on individual colours and parts of the model and getting them finished completely before moving on to the next colour. Here on my wet palette you can see the blues that I've chosen. We've got the mid-tone that we use for the base coat, which is just Vallejo blue, and then we've got another Vallejo model colour blue for the shadows, which is Prussian blue from the model colour range, and then obviously a little bit of black just to mix in and bring the shadows right down into the creases of the armour to a much darker colour. This is what I normally do with my wet palette. I get the range of colours that I'm either looking to highlight and shade with, and then I mix them all together to get a gradient. And then when I'm painting the colour I can quickly go back. If I make a mistake with a darker colour I can quickly go back and grab some of the mid-tone to cover my mistake. It also allows me to choose colours throughout the gradient that I have on my palette to suit the areas that I'm working on at the time. Starting with the Prussian blue, starting to work in quite a chunky shadow into the darker areas. I want the lighter areas to be up near his chest and his face, so a lot of this underneath stuff will be almost completely covered in the Prussian blue, and then some of the black mixture afterwards. It's just to draw attention to the top of the model and the focal point of the face. The consistency of the paint I'm using to do the shading is not far off a glaze consistency. I'll probably go over the areas once or twice with the shade colour and then fill back in with the colours as needed where I've made mistakes or gone too far out of the realms of where I want the shadow. It's a bit of a back and forth process. I'll do the same sort of thing with the highlights later on. just to make the panel lining slightly easier. By panel lining I mean getting right into the crevices of the marine, I've added some of the Dahlia and Rowney black ink to my mixture of the shadows. I do this a lot purely to slightly thin the paint, which also makes it flow nicer into the recesses of the model, almost a bit like a wash, but it just helps sometimes to get it into the areas that you want. You just got to be careful not to have too much on your brush to overspill out into the areas you're not trying to hit, but it's not a huge problem in the shadows. You could go back over it with whichever shadow colour is slightly lighter than the one you were using. Back to the palette then, just to show you my highlight colours for the blue. I've gone for Vallejo Game Colour Electric Blue, and then I've gone for a white. I believe this one is just the Vallejo Model Colour White. But on top of that I've also added a tiny drop of the Dahlia and Rowney white ink onto my palette as well. For a slightly different reason than the black ink. It does allow the mixture to thin down and flow better, but it also, with white paint, sometimes you can find it could be a little bit chalky. I'm of the opinion that if you add some of this white ink to your white paint, not only does it not dry out on your brush as fast, but you tend to get less of a chalky appearance when it's actually finished drying. Just going over the areas of the model which require highlighting, focusing again nearer the top of the model and the face. I'll go around and do a slightly chunkier highlight in the electric blue mix, and then as I gradually add more of the white to that mix, I'll thin the highlight down as much as I can and just hit the edges. This still is after the first round of highlights. I had to cut quite a lot of that footage. It went a little bit blurry on me. There's a second round of highlights now, again just hitting the very top areas that I want to stand out the most, adding more white as I go along in my mixture on my wet palette. Here's a still of the finished blue highlights on the Primaris Marine. I'm pretty happy with the outcome. It's definitely good enough for tabletop for me. And with that we can now move on to the next colour. I started with quite a dark base coat on the cream cloth, so from here I'm probably mainly going to work up as opposed to up and down. And the first highlight is just some of the tan earth from Vallejo Model Colour mixed in with my next colour up, which is stone grey, also from the Model Colour range. It's about a 50-50 mix. I'm not particularly scientific about measuring out my mixes of paint. I just mix it until I get a good colour or a medium in between the two colours that I'm mixing most of the time. A lot of the inner cloak, especially the part by the legs of the librarian, is in most of the area that I want to see as shadow. So it's really just picking out the very edges of the cloak and making them stand out while paying a little bit more attention to the bits that drape over his chest. as the scroll on his chest is up near the top of the body, using most of that mix to cover the scroll, only leaving the very darkest recesses, working it towards the middle where I want it to be brightest, and then I'll come back to the top area later and probably shade down the edges slightly with a wash, just to keep it nice and bright as it's near the top. A very quick go over the purity seals, not too fussy about these, just some lines across them to make them look like parchment, leaving the recesses as the darker colour. Coming back in now with the almost pure stone grey, perhaps even a little bit of deck tan mixed in. Hard to judge exactly because I've mixed my palette as I did in the previous steps. Nice and watered down now, not too thick. Got my Artist Opus brush here just to get the fine tip to make the edge highlights easier without getting the colour on the rest of the model, especially the blue that we've already painted. Just as an aside, I missed a bit of filming, got carried away. I went back in and glazed in a mixture of skeleton contrast and tan earth into the shadows of all the cream areas. Onto the black again now. At this point I've decided that actually I think it looked better quite a bit darker. So I'm going to go over the grey areas with a mixture of game colour black and the black ink as previously mentioned earlier. I mixed this mixture of the black paint down to a thinner consistency to act almost like a contrast paint. As I applied it, it really made the recesses darker, whilst leaving the top surfaces slightly lighter to give me a bit of a matte to highlight later on in the process. I have to apologise for the quality here. Not really sure what happened. I must have had the camera out of focus, but hopefully you can still kind of see what's going on. I wanted to leave this in just to show you that I went over with a mixture of the black colour that I had and mixed in some of the deck tan and some of the stone grey that I was using in the previous steps, just to lighten it up. Again, keeping it nice and thin, using a brush with a good point, just to get a little bit of highlight on the black so it wasn't a flat colour. Obviously the same with the skull, and I'll follow up with some edge highlights around the rim of the shoulder pad. Again, apologies for the quality of this part, I'm not really sure what happened, but I'll make it better for future videos. Working up here again to the next level of highlight, not putting a lot of work into much of the black in terms of the highlight, except the shoulder area and the chest eagle. See, they're closer to the face, which we want to make the focal point. So most of the really bright highlights will be in those areas. With the black completed, it's time to move on to the most Blood Angel part of the model, and that's getting this red right. I'm going to leave this whole red process for the cloak pretty much unedited. I might cut a few bits out here and there just to speed it up, but the process is the same as I went through with the blue. I've got all the colours on my palette, starting with the red mid-tone that I use for the base coat. For shadows, I've just mixed in a little bit of black with it on my palette, and then all the way up to the highlights I've got a carmine red and then some yellow. And you might think yellow is an odd choice, but I find if you highlight your red with white, or you mix in white to your red colour, then sometimes it can really desaturate it and turn it sort of pinky colour, which I wanted to avoid on this model. And I found that if you use yellow to mix in with your red, you still get a highlight colour. It tends to lean slightly more towards the orange spectrum without being too orange, and I like how it looks. As you can see through my first pass, I've been focusing on the shadowy areas, just reinforcing those with the mid-tone and mixed in with a little bit of black, and then we'll start working on the highlights around the cloak. This is going to be a very quick and easy way of doing highlights and shadows on a cloak. I'm not going into major detail. The gradients are going to be pretty rough and pretty visible, and then I'm going to go over them at the end and explain how to tie them together with a bit of a glaze slash wash using a couple of the red colours that I have available. Hopefully now you'll be able to see the different tones of red I'm starting to get on the model. They kind of look like stripes. I'm just doing the top of the shoulder pad here to give it a bit of a highlight. I find that red sometimes doesn't pick up very well on camera, but you should be able to see a bit of the differentiation in the colours on the cloak. As I said before, we were going over them in a minute with a glaze / wash to try and tie some of those harder edges in and make it more smooth. So here you can see I'm happy with where my shadows and highlights are, and it's time for the glaze at the end. So I've got some Daler Rowney ink, fluorescent orange, and I've got some Citadel Blood Angels contrast. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these two up, because they're a contrast and an ink, I won't need to thin them down. I'll just mix them together. I'm going to cover all the red areas on the model in this glaze colour that I've mixed up. As you'll see, because it's got some of the contrast in it, it will do that shadows and highlights thing that it does, and also with the really punchy fluorescent orange ink, it will just bring a lot more of that red saturation back to the cloak and bring it to life a little bit. Because the ink is there, it may end a little bit glossy, but I plan on hitting this model with some matte varnish at the end, which will get rid of any residual glossy look left over by the ink. Moving on to some of the details now that the red's finished, starting with the power sword. I'm going to go here with a slight gradient from a yellow to an orange, nothing too fancy. Starting off with a wash of the skeleton horde down into the lower part of the blade, which I want to be darker, and then mixing up a nice bright yellow. I think this is Vallejo model colour deep yellow, and mixed in with a little bit of white later on, you'll see, and just again back and forth process of adding more highlight and more shade, and then when I'm happy with that, I'm going to go over it again with a glaze, and I'll explain that when we get to it. Okay, fairly happy with where I am with the sword at the moment, so we will now put on the inks. I've got a fluorescent orange ink, the same one used in the red mix. I'm going to glaze that from the middle down to the base, just to introduce a shadow. I've also got a fluorescent yellow ink which will glaze in the opposite direction, again from the middle with a little bit of an overlap to provide the highlight colour. Again, doing this multiple times until achieving the desired fade or gradient. Getting to the final details now, just to tidy up the little pieces of the model that we've not covered so far. I have already painted the eyes in red, but I wanted them to stand out a little bit more, so I've got some of that fluorescent orange ink again, and I'm just going to run it into the lenses just to make them stand out a little bit more as they are part of the focal point near the head. I do have a small tip brush to do this one. I think it's a 000 of some description, and you just need a steady hand. Moving on then to the motif on the sword, I decided to tie it in with the rest of the purple colour, so I just did a couple of coats of the royal purple that we have on the book cover, and then that's pretty much it. I've put a still in here of the pre-varnished final model because I'm going to share with you a top tip that I discovered. I'm very used to using matte varnish on my models, and this isn't something unusual. I've never had a problem before, but at this stage I had the hairdryer out because I was trying to speed up the process of making the video. Matte varnish does not appreciate being hit with a hairdryer. It dried kind of funny, and it's left a bit of a weird texture on the model, and I've got sort of little bubbles in the recesses where it's obviously dried too quick and didn't like it. That aside, this was a fun project, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video. It is one of the longer ones, and once again I'd like to apologise for some of the blurry shots, and I still tend to move the model around a lot in my hands when I'm painting. Hopefully you enjoyed it though, and if you like my stuff you can visit my website at paintbattleandroll.co.uk. I have a blog and a miniatures gallery. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch. If you like it, there'll be more videos like this coming, so hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you later. Bye.